This is where it's going to get interesting because now we can talk about the advantages and disadvantages to using your smartphone as your main camera over a DSLR. Hello and welcome to the All About Photography podcast. I'm your host Pien, and here we're going to discuss all things photography related. We'll cover different photography genres, topics related to photography as an art, and also the business side of it for those who are running a photography business. And welcome back to the All About Photography podcast, where we discuss anything and everything photography related. With a new episode released every Monday at midnight Greenwich Mean Time, it's a good way to start off your week with something new to learn about regarding photography or something new that we can discuss to get the week started off as well. And we are available on all of your favorite podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon, but we're also now doing a video on YouTube that will also be on the Pien VC Photography YouTube channel. So if you would want to watch instead of just listen along, you're welcome to do so there. They will be uploaded to YouTube at the same time. So for those of you watching on YouTube, hello. Just give you a quick camera wave. For those of you just listening, unfortunately, you'll miss out on the waves, but you know it's there. This week, I wanted to talk about the age-old topic of DSLRs or mirrorless cameras versus smartphones. With Apple's recent release of the iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Pro, it has brought up that same topic that comes up very often, which is, do you still need to buy a DSLR with the way that smartphone cameras are nowadays? And as always with many things in photography and life in general for that matter, the answer is always, it depends. Because it depends on your use case. So that's what we'll go over today is, can your smartphone actually replace your camera? To make things easier, I'm just going to refer to the iPhone 14 Pro only, because that's the one that has their new 48 megapixel sensor. And also, instead of having to say 48 megapixel sensor every time, one, because it's a tongue twister, and two, because it's going to be so ingrained in your head, you're just going to be saying it for the rest of the day, I'm just going to call it their larger sensor moving forward, or just the 14 Pro, in reference to the phone, just to make life easy. Now, from my understanding, it is the first time Apple has actually released a phone with such a large sensor to it, or large megapixel sensor, I should say. And it has opened up a range of benefits now that weren't currently there before on iPhones. They were there on a few Android phones, but I don't want to get into the whole Apple versus Android debate or iOS versus Android debate at this point, because those who prefer iOS will stick with iOS. Those who prefer Android will stick with Android. Those who don't mind fluctuating between the two will fluctuate between the two. Whatever makes you happy, whatever system you like using, as long as it does what you need it to do, that's all that matters. I don't want to get into that debate because it's never ending. I can use both. I just use Android because I've got a Windows laptop. But eventually I will probably swap out to iOS because I've got an iPad and thinking of getting a MacBook Pro or a Mac Studio. So we'll have to wait and see. Now, with the new 14 Pro and their new large sensor, one great thing they've got is the option to do pixel binning in low light situations. What that does is that takes 4 pixels and combines it into one larger one. So that larger pixel can then gather more light and you'll have a less noisy image as a result of it. Which, for anyone who's taken picture in low light situations and you see that noise and that grain, it always ruins the image. Nobody really likes it. So the fact that you don't have to worry about that so much anymore is great. But it does come at the cost that instead of the large 48 megapixels, you will have a 12 megapixel image instead. Now, depending on what you do on that image may or may not affect you. It's completely up to personal use cases. We won't get into the printing side of it yet. That will come up later in the episode, but that is something to bear in mind when you are using their night mode features. Now, in saying that, if you did want to get the most out of the sensor, you do have the option to shoot an Apple Pro Roll, which does give you much more flexibility in editing your photos if you use apps like Lightroom Mobile or even Photoshop on your phone, or if you transfer it to an iPad to edit it on there as an example. And they have the other standard features that you have in their camera app, like your portraits with a few lighting effects, night mode, and then my two favorite ones, Panorama and Macro, although Panorama is the one that I use the most. This is where it's going to get interesting because now we can talk about the advantages and disadvantages to using your smartphone as your main camera over a DSLR. We will focus mostly on the benefits and negatives of a smartphone, not so much on the DSLR side, but we will compare the two later on, so make sure you stick around for that. One of the best things about using your smartphone as your everyday camera is you're already carrying your smartphone around with you anyway. If you think about it, you've got a camera, a phone, a messaging app, your social media, your games. The list goes on. It's got everything you need to do on almost anything in this day and age on that small device that sits in your pocket, or if you've got one of the bigger devices in a bag that you carry around with you. So you've always got a camera on hand. You don't need to worry about packing a DSLR. And if you've got the right lens and the batteries are charged up and the SD card is ready to go and all of that stuff, because you've already got your phone with you. So that's one of the great things now, is that with all these smartphones now being able to take such amazing images, that the requirement to carry a DSLR with a big lens around with you, well, big relatively speaking, but to have to carry around your camera and lens with you all the time to make sure you get an amazing image just in case it comes up, is becoming less required because of the mere fact that now you have everything in your phone. If you remember, just what was 12, 14 years ago at the time this was made, that iPhones were just released, and back then the images weren't so great. You were still using a DSLR. But now I have seen amazing images come out of phones that it does make me question, do you actually need to carry a camera around with you all the time? I shoot in RAW on my phone when I feel like it. I don't just shoot the standard one unless I just want to take a quick snapshot of whatever's currently going on, which in my case is normally just a dog playing around. And like I mentioned earlier, if you shoot in RAW, if your phone allows it, that is, or you have the app to do so, is you can then edit that photo the same way you would a DSLR picture using the Lightroom mobile app or Photoshop, whichever one you prefer. And there's other apps out there that you can use to edit your photos as well. Or if you just wanted to edit it on your social media app, because those have great editing tools now as well, you can do that too. You don't have to use Lightroom or Photoshop to edit your pictures. You can literally edit it on like Instagram before you post it if you wanted to. And so that makes it a lot easier to take a great photo, edit it the way you want to, and then share it straight away without having to take a picture, go home, load it on computer, load up the app, edit it, save it for a social media size or a size that's easy to send across email and text messaging apps, and then you're good to go. Think how much easier it is to do it all on the phone now compared to how it normally is with that whole process I've just listed out. Picture, edit, crop, share, or resize, share. And granted, yes, most phones nowadays have a wide angle lens, a super wide angle, and a telephoto, and you can zoom in as well with the telephoto, so you can zoom in even further, but my experience with that is the quality of the image does degrade quite a bit, so that's neither here nor there right now. But lots of companies are also making lenses that you can use for your phones. That if you wanted to go super wide angle, you can buy a lens that attaches to it. If you wanted to go more macro than your phone currently lets you, you can buy a lens that attaches to it. So there are lots of options for you now if you just wanted to be able to take amazing pictures with your phone and not have to worry about buying a camera. And also, if you look at it, a phone is a lot cheaper than a camera once you factor in all the lenses and accessories and everything else you would need to get. But what about the downsides to just relying on your phone to be your camera? Now, I know I have praised how you can use your phone as a camera, but there are a few pitfalls you have to be aware of as well, which, especially as a landscape photographer, the big one is you cannot print those images large. Many people will say you can because, yes, like with the new iPhone 14 Pro, you've got a larger sensor on there, which does give you a very large image to play with. But you have to bear in mind that because the sensor is very, very, very small compared to a full frame camera, that those pixels are tiny. 48 megapixels on an iPhone sensor, even if it's bigger than it used to be, is still tiny. Even smaller than Micro Four Thirds, even smaller than a GoPro. So if you were to try to expand it to the full size it is, that you want to try and print it at the same size as what you get out of a full frame, it is going to look horrendous. You will be limited to how large you can print your images that you get from a smartphone, regardless of the size of the megapixel sensor that you've got. And also, even though lots of the lenses on your phones are now fixed apertures like f1.7, I've seen in most cases, the bokeh that you get out of those lenses compared to something like a 51.8 or an 85 1.8 or a 1.4, it just doesn't look as good. It doesn't look bad, but it just doesn't look as good as what you get out of a DSLR with something like an 85 1.4. If you can take amazing portraits with it, don't get me wrong, but that bokeh look that you get, bokeh, different people pronounce it different ways, but that bokeh look you get out of it is just not going to look as good. You can fix it later on in post, yes, but it's also a lot easier to just get it right in the camera the first time and not have to edit it in post, ignoring the whole different process of editing, sharing, etc., versus of a phone versus a camera. But that background blur that you get out of a camera is very hard to replicate in a phone, and oftentimes because that sensor is so small, you have to bear in mind, even though it's f1.7, it's still a very large depth of field. All right, as a prime example, if you took something like f1.8 on full frame and compared it to a micro four thirds, it's not f1.8. It's closer to f5.6. f1.8 on a full frame is not the same as f1.8 on micro four thirds. Your full frame the focal range already doubles, but the aperture nearly triples. So just bear that in mind. 1.7 on a phone is not 1.7 full frame. And also, in regards to editing the images, and also because in a lot of cases, the megapixels on most phone sensors are not that high. There are a few brands out there with very high-res sensors, yes, but because in most cases they are lower-res sensors, you do have less flexibility to crop and edit pictures on your phone compared to something like images taken on a Sony a7R4 at 61 megapixels or Canon's R5 at 45 megapixels. So that's just something to bear in mind. You can edit the photos you take on a phone, but you just don't have as much flexibility, and the bokeh is just not going to look as good either. And one last disadvantage, which can also have the same argument made to DSLRs, is that unless you shoot RAW, or whatever camera you're using lets you shoot RAW, how your image looks is going to be determined by the software on the phone or the app that you're using. Although in most cases, let's be honest, it's an app. A prime example, I was doing a job once and the images that came out of the customer's iPhone looked much more saturated than even the JPEGs that came out of my camera. And that's just the way that they're processed. The saturation levels on iPhone images are significantly higher than most JPEGs that come out of a DSLR. So depending on which app you're using, you are at the mercy of how their software is going to render the colors. They may render them accurately, they may not. They may play around with the contrast and the saturation and the vibrance. And that's why I said unless you shoot RAW, you have less editing flexibility because you then have to go and edit the software's actual edits. So you're doing an edit on top of an edit. You're not editing a RAW file. Some people love the colors that come out of an iPhone or a Samsung or an Oppo, whatever they prefer to use. Some people don't, and some people want full flexibility. But just bear in mind that unless you're shooting RAW on a smartphone, regardless if it's iPhone or not, that color profile, the colors that have been added is the color profile set by the manufacturer. And now that we've gone over the advantages of a smartphone and the disadvantages of a smartphone as your main daily camera, which one should you use more often or on a daily basis, your phone or your DSLR? And it's, like I said at the beginning of the episode, is that it depends. There is no right or wrong solution to you. Yes, bringing a phone around is a lot easier than bringing a camera around. Even if you got a small micro four thirds or one of the smaller Sony crop sensor cameras, bringing your phone is still a lot easier because you've already carrying it around with you. You don't need to worry about any extra devices or extra batteries or SD cards or anything else. Your device is already in your pocket that you're using anyway. And at the same time, if all you want to do is capture snapshots that you just want to share with friends, family, social media, whatever the case is, it's a lot easier to share that if you've just taken that picture with your phone than if you've taken it with your camera and then have to try and either get it to your phone or wait until you get home to edit it on your computer. Now, a lot of us just want to take that picture and share it straight away, which I get. I do that sometimes as well. And it's a lot easier to do that with your phone than it is with a camera. Especially if you're using a camera and you want to try and transfer it and the app doesn't work, and then you can't share it and you have to wait to get home. That's a nightmare, which having been through it on multiple occasions, I can say is not fun, which at least it makes it easier that if you've taken a picture on your phone in RAW, you can edit it using Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever you want, and then post it and then share it versus using a camera. But at the same time, there are a few caveats to that. Like if you want to be completely creative and have much more flexibility with how you're going to take your image, you have to stick with a camera. The phone and the software just doesn't cut it yet. It may do in the next few years. We have to wait and see. But at this point in time, there just isn't as much flexibility on a phone as there is on a camera. I would like to see someone try and replicate my 20-minute image that I've taken during the day because I put a 10-stop ND filter and a polarizer to take pictures of waterfalls. I would like to see someone try and replicate that with a phone. Yes, you can take long exposures with your phone if you chuck it on a tripod, and yes, you can get NT filters, but I highly doubt that you'd be able to replicate the same image and print it to the same size if you took it with any of the phones that are currently out there today compared to when I took it with a camera. I'm not bragging to say I took an amazing image. I'm just trying to say, if you can replicate that, I'd like to hear from you. But if not, that's why you still need a camera. Because if you want to be really creative, you really want to play around with stuff, and you want to have full flexibility in editing, you still need to use a camera. You still have to. There is no option around it. Yes, your phone can do amazing pictures, but if you want the full capability to edit however you want it and have the option to print it large, unless you're using something like a Sony a7S III that has a 12 megapixel sensor, then you still need a DSLR. If you're not interested in any of that and you just want to take snapshots to capture the memories and share it with your friends, family, and everything, stick with a phone. A camera is if you want to start doing more than what a phone can offer you, regardless of which phone you've currently got. And the last point to bring up as to whether you should go with a phone or a camera is your budget. All right, I will never tell anyone how to spend their money. I just present the information and let them choose themselves. That's how I've always wanted to do it. And that's how I always have done it and always will. I will not tell you how to spend your money. But if you are budget conscious and you're not worried about printing large or having full editing capabilities, then yes, just stick with a phone. Don't worry about buying a camera and all the lenses you have to get, because you can get about 5 phones for the price of a full camera setup, to put it in perspective. And also, with the way phones are being released nowadays, you don't even need to worry about upgrading every year either. Yes, whenever there is a huge step up or your phone is dying, then yes, upgrading makes sense. But if you take my current situation as an example, I've currently got a Samsung S21. Not because I'm an Apple hater, not because I'm an Android fanboy, but when I looked at the features and options, but like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to get into that whole debate. I just went with that because I just preferred the options of what Android currently offers versus iOS. It's that simple. But there is also not enough reason for me to upgrade to something like an iPhone 14 Pro at the prices Apple is currently charging. If you compare the price of the new phone compared to how little actual return on investment, financially speaking, I would get from it, it makes 0 sense to do such an upgrade. So if you are someone who's budget conscious, or you're not sure if you actually need to upgrade all the time, if the phone is doing everything you currently need it to do, or if the camera on the phone is currently doing everything you need it to do, it's up to you. If you just want the new camera or the new specs, then yeah, upgrade. But if you just would rather get a few accessories to help it out, get the accessories instead. It's completely up to you. And one thing I have touched on briefly throughout this episode is, can you print images from a smartphone? And yes, you can. I will never say no, you can't. But, and there is always a but, you just can't print as large compared to the images you get from a DSLR. Even if we look at Apple's new 48 megapixel sensor, you get an image that is 8,000 by 6,000 pixels. But, as I've also mentioned, those pixels are tiny. Even if the sensor is bigger than it used to be, the sensor is still tiny. So if you took that 48 megapixel sensor, put it next to a full frame, you can fit in a lot of the new sensor into a full frame sensor. So whilst you can print large, the image just won't look good. I've tried it. Not with the actual 14 Pro, but I have tried printing out images from a phone before. And anything above A4, it just didn't look good, because the sensor is too small and the pixels are too small to be able to print anything larger. Granted, yes, there is software that can help you increase the size of the image, but it just doesn't look as good as something you get from a full frame or even a medium format sensor, or even APS-C, I should say, for that matter as well. You can still get amazing images out of a crop sensor camera and much better quality to print larger than you can out of a phone. I'm not shitting on phones, I'm just saying that if you want to print large, you still have to go with a camera. If it's just A4 or postcard size, use your phone. You can get away with your phone left, right, and center for that. Anything bigger than an A4 or close to an A3, stick with your camera. Don't go with a phone to print that. It's just not going to look good no matter how much work you try and do. And it's also a lot easier to just take a picture with a DSLR, edit it, versus take a picture with your phone, hope that it's in RAW, get it onto the computer, edit it, resize it accordingly, and then hope it comes out good. Which one's better? I'd rather just use a DSLR, get the image straight away, and know that I can print it as big as, well, nearly as big as I want, and not have to worry about the image quality at even a 30 by 20 inch image. So what do you think? Do we still need DSLRs today with the way that smartphone cameras are currently being developed, or are DSLRs slowly dying? I'd love to hear from you. As always, my email address is available to you in the show notes below. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will put it in the description for you as well. And I would also love to hear from you if you've got any feedback about the show as well. As always, thanks for listening. If you would like to keep up to date with new episodes, don't forget you can follow us on your favorite podcasting platforms, your Spotify, Apple Podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube, Just gave you a little wave there as well. You can subscribe to the channel so you can see whenever a new episode comes out, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is every Monday at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. And if you would like to leave a review, that would be greatly appreciated as well. But I'll leave it there for now. This is your host, Pien, signing off, and I'll see you on the next episode. Have a good one.